Isolde Bramwell had spent 72 years believing that a life given completely to others would at least earn her a place to grow old with some measure of peace. She was wrong. On a gray Tuesday morning in Copperveil, Oregon, her 3 children handed her a single packed bag, told her the house she'd lived in for 26 years was being sold, and watched her walk away without a word of apology between them. What they didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that the abandoned greenhouse at the edge of town, the one their grandmother had built with her own hands and that the whole family had dismissed as a rotting eyesore for 15 years, was holding something beneath its floor that would bring every carefully constructed lie in Copperveil crashing down before the week was out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it happened, Isolde had been making tea. That detail stayed with her afterward, the absolute ordinariness of it. The kettle was on. She'd set out her favorite ceramic mug, the one with the small chip on the handle that she'd never bothered replacing because it still worked perfectly well. She was wearing her house slippers and listening to the rain tap against the kitchen window the way it did every November in Copperveil, soft and persistent and almost musical if you were in the right frame of mind. She was not in the right frame of mind when Thaddeus walked in. Her eldest son was 49 years old, a commercial property attorney with a firm in Portland who visited Copperveil 4 times a year at most, usually around holidays, always briefly. He had his father's height and none of his father's warmth. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, placed a manila folder in front of him, and folded his hands on top of it the way Isolde imagined he did in client meetings when he was about to deliver news he didn't particularly care how the other person received. "We need to talk about the house," he said. Karina appeared in the doorway a moment later, which told Isolde this had been coordinated. Her daughter was 46, lived 20 minutes away in a newer part of town, and had spent most of her adult life being faintly embarrassed by Isolde in ways she never quite articulated but never quite concealed either. She was dressed as though she had somewhere more important to be afterward, which was probably intentional. Oswin came last, shuffling in from the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets, avoiding eye contact from the moment he entered the room. He was 43, the youngest, and had always dealt with discomfort by making himself as physically small as possible while still technically being present. He leaned against the counter near the door, close enough to be part of the conversation, far enough to suggest he might leave it at any moment. Isolde turned off the kettle. She didn't sit down. She stood with her back to the counter and looked at her 3 children arranged around her kitchen like they'd rehearsed the blocking, and she felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the November air coming through the gap under the back door. Thaddeus opened the folder. There were documents inside, official-looking, already signed in several places. He slid them across the table toward her. "The property has been listed," he said. "We've accepted an offer. Closing is scheduled for the 18th, which gives you just under 3 weeks to make arrangements." Isolde looked at the documents without touching them. She'd lived in this house since 1998. She'd moved in a year after her husband Gareth died of a heart attack at 54, leaving her with 3 grieving children, a modest life insurance payout, and the particular exhaustion that comes from being both the person most devastated by a loss and the person everyone expects to manage its aftermath. The landlord at the time, an elderly widower named Clifton Bray, had known Gareth from the local hardware cooperative. He'd offered Isolde a long-term rental arrangement at a rate she could manage on her seamstress income, telling her she could stay as long as she needed. That stability mattered more than profit. Clifton had died 14 months ago at 88. His son, who lived in Seattle and had never set foot in Copperveil as far as Isolde knew, inherited the property and moved immediately to liquidate it. What Isolde had not known, until Thaddeus spread those documents across her kitchen table, was that her own children had been in contact with Clifton's son for weeks, that they had, in fact, encouraged the sale, that they had agreed amongst themselves that this was the right moment to push for what Thaddeus called, according to Karina later, a cleaner situation. "You've been speaking with the new owner," Isolde said. It wasn't a question. "We've been trying to handle this practically," Karina said from the doorway, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while doing something that wasn't. "You can't stay here indefinitely. The rent is going up regardless, and frankly, Mom, you're 72. You need more support than any of us can realistically provide while you're out here managing a whole house alone." "I've been managing this house alone for 26 years, Isolde said. "We know," Oswin said quietly, still looking at the floor. "That's sort of the point." She asked them what they expected her to do, where specifically they imagined she would go. The responses came back with the practiced fluency of people who had clearly discussed this at length without her. "There was a senior living facility 20 miles east called Pine Haven," Thaddeus explained. "Clean, well-reviewed, a waiting list that he had already made inquiries about. If she applied now, there might be a place within 4 to 6 months. In the meantime, a short-term rental in town, something small. He'd looked at a few options online, and there were some perfectly adequate one-bedroom apartments available." Isolde listened to all of it with her hands flat on the counter behind her. She was being managed. That was the word that kept surfacing as Thaddeus talked. She was being processed by her own children the way a difficult administrative problem gets processed efficiently and without much feeling by people who've already decided on the outcome and are now simply executing the steps. She thought about everything she'd given to the three of them. The years of school lunches packed before dawn because she had early alterations work and there was no other way to make the timing work. The costumes she'd sewn by hand for every school play because they couldn't afford to rent them. The nights she'd sat outside Oswin's bedroom door when he was 14 and going through something he couldn't name, not intruding, just being there in case he needed to hear a voice in the dark. The way she'd worked 6 days a week for 11 years after Gareth died, so that all three of them could finish school without debt. None of that appeared to be relevant to the conversation currently happening in her kitchen. "I won't be going to Pine Haven," she said when Thaddeus finished. Karina's expression shifted to the particular variety of exasperation that Isolde had watched her practice since adolescence. "Mom, we're not trying to punish you. We're trying to be realistic about what's actually sustainable." "I have somewhere to go," Isolde said. That stopped them. She hadn't planned to say it. The words arrived on their own, propelled by something between desperation and the sudden, startling memory of a promise she'd carried for so long she'd almost stopped feeling its weight. Her mother's greenhouse. Waverly Thistlewood's greenhouse, out on the old Caldwell Road property at the edge of Copperveil, where the main structure had been left empty and slowly deteriorating since Waverly died 15 years ago. The greenhouse attached to the back of the property, the one Waverly had built herself in the early 1970s and had always called her thinking place, her private world, the only space in Copperveil that was fully and entirely hers. Thaddeus looked at Karina. Karina looked at Oswin. The three of them shared the expression of people who've just watched something they expected to go smoothly take an unexpected turn. "The old Thistlewood property," Thaddeus said slowly. "Mom, that place has been sitting empty for 15 years. The main house is practically caved in. The greenhouse roof is probably gone by now. The greenhouse structure is built into the hillside," Isolde said. "Stone and timber. Your grandmother built it to last." "You can't live in a greenhouse," Karina said, and there was something in her voice that Isolde recognized as the close cousin of contempt, dressed up just well enough to pass for concern. "I'm not asking for your opinion on it," Isolde said. "I'm telling you where I'll be." She picked up her bag from the hallway, the single one she'd been allowed to pack, and walked to the front door. Behind her, she heard Thaddeus say something to the others in a low voice, and then, louder, clearly intended for her to hear, "Give her a few days. Once she sees the state of that place, she'll come around." Isolde closed the front door behind her without slamming it. She walked down the porch steps and turned left onto Alder Street, in the direction of Caldwell Road, in the direction of a greenhouse she hadn't entered in over 4 decades, and in the direction of a promise her mother had pressed in her hand on a cold February morning 41 years ago, whispering words that Isolde had carried like a stone in her pocket ever since. "When everything falls away, go to the greenhouse. Go to the floor. I left you what you'll need. Promise me, Izzy. Promise me you'll remember." She had promised. She had never gone back. Until now. The road to Caldwell Road was 3.5 miles from Alder Street, and Isolde walked every inch of it. She hadn't driven in 2 years, not since her eyesight had started giving her trouble at dusk, and she decided quietly, without telling anyone, that it was the responsible thing to do. Her children had never noticed the car, sitting unused in the driveway. That said something about how closely they'd been paying attention. The morning had stopped raining, but the pavement was still dark with it, and the air smelled of wet pine and wood smoke from chimneys along the residential stretch of town. Copperveil in November was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself dramatically. It settled in gradually, working its way through your coat one layer at a time until you realized your fingers had gone stiff without you noticing. Isolde pulled her collar up and kept moving. She passed the post office where she'd collected mail for 26 years. She passed the small hardware shop that had changed hands 3 times since Gareth used to buy his woodworking supplies there. She passed the church hall where she'd done alterations work for the Women's Guild every spring for a decade, hemming curtains and repairing choir robes until the new minister's wife decided to order everything from a catalog instead. Small abandonments, the kind that accumulate so gradually you don't realize how many there are until you're walking past all of them at once with a single bag over your shoulder and nowhere to sleep that night. Copperveil was not a large town, just under 4,000 people, clustered around a main street that still had the bones of something charming, even if the flesh of it had thinned over the years. A few good restaurants, a library that punched above its weight, a community board outside the post office perpetually layered with flyers for events that had already happened. The kind of town where everyone knew your name and felt entitled to know your business, which could feel like warmth when things were going well and like surveillance when they weren't. Isolde had moved here from Portland at 22, following her mother. Waverly Thistlewood had come to Copperveil first, in 1971, with $60, a second-hand truck, and the specific determination of a woman who had spent her first 40 years being told what she could and couldn't do and had finally run out of patience with the arrangement. She'd found the Caldwell Road property through a county land auction, a neglected parcel with a weathered farmhouse and a south-facing hillside she immediately recognized as something. She'd spent the first year repairing the farmhouse roof and the second year building the greenhouse. She built it herself, largely, hired a stonemason named Ference Bly for 3 weeks to help with the foundation and the retaining wall, then took over the rest, timber framing and glass panels, and the long wooden workbenches she designed herself based on a photograph she'd torn from a gardening magazine. She grew everything, tomatoes and peppers through summer, hardy greens through winter, orchids and fuchsias and things with Latin names Isolde could never remember but could still picture exactly, hanging in their terracotta pots along the south-facing glass in colors that seemed almost aggressive against the gray Oregon sky. The greenhouse was where Waverly went to think. Everyone in the family understood that without being told directly. When the door to the greenhouse was closed, you didn't knock. You let her have it. Isolde had loved that greenhouse as a child, had spent hours in it as a teenager, sitting on an overturned bucket while her mother worked, talking about things that felt too large for the house. School problems, friend problems, the particular loneliness of being 17 in a small town. Waverly had always listened while she worked, hands moving through soil or along a vine, never stopping, never making Isolde feel like an interruption. She hadn't gone back after the thing with Crispin Holloway. She couldn't for a long time. The greenhouse was braided too tightly with the version of herself that existed before that. The woman she'd been at 31 who still believed that doing the right thing was sufficient protection against people who wanted to do the wrong one. Going back to the greenhouse meant being in the place where that version of herself had last fell whole, and for years that had been more than she could manage. Then Waverly died, and the farmhouse sat empty, and the years kept passing, and eventually the greenhouse became something Isolde thought about in the abstract, the way you think about a place from a dream. Present but unreachable. Real but not quite solid. She could see the Caldwell Road turn off ahead now, where the pavement ended and a gravel track continued through a stand of Douglas fir. The property was another quarter-mile in. No mailbox anymore. The post had rotted at the base and fallen years ago. But she knew the turn without a marker. Her feet remembered it. That was the first thing. After everything, After 15 years of nobody and the farmhouse caving in on itself, the greenhouse was standing. The timber frame had weathered dark but held its shape. Several glass panels along the upper section had cracked or fallen and been replaced over the years. She could see, by sheets of corrugated plastic, that Waverly must have added before she died. Moss covered the stone base thickly, and a climbing plant of some kind had worked its way up the south wall and across part of the roof. But beneath all of that, the structure her mother had built with her own hands was intact. The door was a heavy wooden panel set into the stone wall at the front, with a cast-iron latch that Isolde remembered the specific weight of. She reached for it and stopped. She stood there for a moment with her hand just short of the latch, not quite touching it. The cold was sharper up here on the hill, the wind coming off the ridge directly, and she could hear it moving through the fir canopy above her with a sound like distant water. Her mother's voice came back to her clearly, the way it always did when she least expected it. "Go to the floor, Izzy. I left you what you'll need." Isolde pressed the latch down and opened the door. The smell hit her first. Earth and green, the particular living dampness of a place where things had been growing for decades without anyone tending them. It wasn't unpleasant. It was the smell of her mother, or rather the smell of the place where her mother had been most fully herself, and it landed on Isolde with a physical weight she hadn't anticipated. She stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The greenhouse was longer than she'd remembered, stretching back into the hillside a good 30 feet, the ceiling high enough at the center that a tall person could stand comfortably. The workbenches her mother had built were still there on both sides, running the length of the space. Though most were empty now, their surfaces thick with dust and the dry remnants of plants that had died years ago without anyone to water them. A few terracotta pots remained on the southern bench, cracked and empty. One orchid had somehow survived, or something had, a thin green stem pushing up through the cracked soil of a pot near the back, as though it had simply decided to continue regardless. The glass panels that remained intact let in a pale, diffused light. The corrugated plastic sections let in a different quality of light, slightly yellower, and the combination gave the whole space a strange warmth that didn't match the cold outside. Isolde set her bag down on the nearest bench and walked slowly toward the back. The floor was stone, the same dark basalt her mother had sourced from a quarry outside Copperveil, laid in irregular pieces with narrow gaps between them, mortared carefully but never sealed. Isolde had helped carry those stones from the truck this summer. She was 23, stacking them along the south wall, while Waverly directed the placement with the focused authority of someone who had already seen the finished floor clearly in her mind and was simply arranging reality to match. She crouched down now and ran her fingers along the gap between two of the larger stones near the back wall, beneath where the main workbench ended. One of them moved. Not much. A fraction of an inch, a slight give that the others didn't have. Isolde pressed harder and felt it again, a looseness that was different from the natural settling of old stone. She stood and went back to her bag, found the short pry tool she'd packed almost without thinking, the one she used for pulling staples from fabric frames, and returned to the stone. It took her 4 minutes to work the stone free. It was heavier than it looked, and her hands ached by the time she got enough of a gap to grip the edge properly and lift. Beneath it was a shallow cavity, maybe 8 inches deep, carved into the earth and lined with flat pieces of slate to keep the moisture out. Inside the cavity sat a metal box, the kind used for document storage, olive green with a simple clasp, its surface dusty but completely dry. Isolde sat back on her heels and looked at it. She had not let herself think too specifically about what she might find here. The promise her mother had made 41 years ago had always felt more like comfort than instruction, the kind of thing a person says at a desperate moment to give someone they love a reason to keep going. She had carried it that way, loosely, without examining it too closely, because examining it closely would have meant confronting the possibility that it was nothing, that grief had made her mother vague, and she'd spent 4 decades holding onto a feeling dressed up as a promise. The box was not nothing. She lifted it out carefully and set it on the workbench, where the light was better. The clasp opened without resistance, hinged and simple, not locked. Waverly had trusted that whoever found this would be the right person, that no lock was necessary because the stone floor itself was lock enough. Inside, wrapped in a layer of oilcloth that had kept everything beneath it perfectly dry, were 3 items. A small notebook with a dark green cover, her mother's handwriting visible on the first page through the cloth. 2 envelopes, sealed, each addressed in different hands. And beneath all of it, folded with the careful precision of someone who understood fabric, a piece of silk the deep amber color of autumn light, the color of the scarf Isolde had worn to the Copperveil Planning Commission meeting on the night of March 4th, 1983. The night everything went wrong. She recognized it instantly. Her hands went very still on the workbench. 41 years she had tried not to think about that night. 41 years of carrying the weight of what Crispin Holloway had done, of being the woman in Copperveil that people whispered about and pitted and quietly avoided, of watching a powerful man continue his comfortable life while hers contracted around her like a fist. 41 years of her own children growing up in the shadow of a story they'd half believed and half resented, never quite deciding whether their mother was someone who'd been wronged or someone who'd brought it on herself. Her mother had known. Waverly had known everything, had gathered what she could, had hidden it here in the floor of the one place that was entirely hers, wrapped it in oilcloth and sealed it under stone and waited, with the particular patience of someone who understood that some truths have to wait for the right moment to become useful. Isolde picked up the notebook first. Waverly Thistlewood's handwriting had always looked like it was in a slight hurry. Not messy, never messy, but with a forward lean to every letter that suggested the hand was trying to keep pace with a mind that moved faster than most. Isolde had grown up reading notes left on kitchen counters, on grocery lists, on the backs of seed packets, and she knew the rhythm of it the way you know a voice. She opened the notebook to the first page and read, "Izzy, if you found this, then something has gone badly enough that you came back here, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I'm not here to sit with you in the way I used to. But I need you to read carefully, because what I'm going to tell you in these pages took me 2 years to piece together, and I don't want a single word of it wasted. Start with the envelopes. Read them before you read anything else I've written here. Then come back to this notebook. The order matters." Isolde closed the notebook and picked up the first envelope. The handwriting on the front was thin and slightly cramped, the letters of someone who wrote carefully because they were afraid of being misread. It was addressed simply to Waverly Thistlewood, Caldwell Road. The postmark was June 1984, 3 months after the Planning Commission meeting that had fractured Isolde's life. She opened it. "Mrs. Thistlewood, you don't know me personally, though I think you may know my face from town. My name is Zenobia Kraft. I worked as the administrative clerk for the Copperveil Planning Commission for 11 years, from 1973 until I resigned my position in April of this year. I am writing to you because I cannot write to Isolde directly. I'm too afraid of what Holloway would do if the letter was intercepted, and I know he watches her mail. I know because he told someone who eventually told me, and that is the kind of town we live in. I was present at the March 4th Commission meeting. I was seated in my usual position at the recording table, 2 feet from where Alderman Holloway sat. I recorded the minutes of that meeting in full, including the discussion regarding the Fenwick Road rezoning proposal that Isolde had submitted on behalf of the Copperveil Small Growers Cooperative. What I recorded and what Holloway subsequently filed as the official minutes of that meeting are not the same document. Isolde's breath moved out of her slowly. The proposal Isolde submitted was sound. It had support from 6 of the 9 commission members. I counted the voices myself and wrote the numbers down in my personal shorthand, as I always did before transcribing the formal record. The vote should have passed. It would have passed had Alderman Holloway not called a recess, taken 3 of the supporting members into the hallway for 20 minutes, and returned to a room where 2 of those 3 voted differently than they had 20 minutes before. I don't know exactly what he said to them in that hallway, but I know what he said to Isolde afterward, when the meeting had closed and most people had left, because I was still at my table gathering my materials, and neither of them noticed me. He told her the proposal failed because she had failed to conduct herself appropriately in her previous dealings with the commission. He told her she had a reputation for being difficult and that difficult women did not get favorable votes in Copperveil. He told her she should consider withdrawing from public advocacy entirely if she wanted to protect what remained of her standing in town. She told him clearly and calmly that she intended to appeal the decision and that she would be going to the county office if necessary. He told her, and I am writing his exact words because I will not soften them, that if she pursued any appeal, he would make sure the entire county knew about her conduct at the August 1982 cooperative dinner, and that she would find a version of events he described unrecognizable but impossible to disprove. I sat completely still at my table and did not breathe. She left. He straightened his jacket and walked out after her. I went home that night and wrote down everything I had witnessed, word for word, in a separate notebook that I have kept hidden since. I am sending you a full copy of those notes enclosed with this letter. I resigned my position 3 weeks later. I told myself it was for personal reasons. The truth is I could not sit in that room with him anymore. I am sending this to you rather than to Isolde because you are her mother and because mothers sometimes know what to do with truth when daughters are too close to the fire to hold it safely. Please forgive me for not being braver than this. I wanted to be. Zenobia Kraft. Isolde set the letter down on the workbench. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She'd expected them to shake. She picked up the second envelope. The second envelope was heavier than the first. The handwriting on the front was broader. The pen pressed harder into the paper, the letters of someone who wrote infrequently and with effort. It was addressed to Waverly in the same way, just her name and the road, no return address. The postmark read September 1984, 6 months after the meeting. Isolde unfolded the pages inside. There were 3 of them, written front and back. Mrs. Thistlewood, my name is Peregrine Moss. I was a land surveyor working independently in Copperveil and the surrounding county from 1971 until 1986, when I relocated my practice to Grants Pass for reasons that are connected to what I'm about to tell you. In the summer of 1982, I was contracted by the Copperveil Planning Commission to conduct a survey of the Fenwick Road corridor in preparation for a series of rezoning proposals that were expected to come before the commission over the following year. One of those proposals, as you likely know, was submitted by your daughter Isolde on behalf of the Small Growers Cooperative. During the course of that survey work, I discovered something that I was not supposed to discover. Alderman Crispin Holloway had, at some point between 1980 and 1982, quietly acquired through a series of holding companies a significant parcel of land adjacent to the Fenwick Road corridor. The acquisition was structured carefully to obscure his involvement. The holding companies were registered in 2 different states, and the connection to Holloway required following a chain of paperwork that I only stumbled across because one of the registered agents happened to share an address with Holloway's brother-in-law's hardware business, which I recognized from a job I'd done the previous year. I want to be precise about what this means. If the Small Growers Cooperative rezoning proposal had passed, the Fenwick Road corridor would have been designated agricultural protection land, which would have significantly reduced the development value of the adjacent parcels Holloway quietly owned. His vote against the proposal, and his apparent pressure on other commission members to reverse their positions, was not a matter of civic judgment. It was a matter of protecting his own financial interests while seated in a position of public trust. That is corruption. I'm not a lawyer, and I won't use the specific legal term, but I know what I saw in those land records and I know what it means. I prepared a full written summary of my findings at the time, intending to bring them to the county oversight office. I made an appointment. 2 days before that appointment, Holloway came to my office. I still don't know how he found out. My best guess is that someone at the records office mentioned my repeated visits and the nature of my request to someone connected to him, and that information traveled the way information always travels in a town this size, sideways and faster than you'd expect. He sat across from my desk, and he was perfectly pleasant about it. That was the part that stayed with me. He didn't threaten me in any dramatic way. He simply mentioned, in the course of a calm conversation, that he understood I had a contract pending with the county for survey work on the new reservoir project, a contract worth more than everything else I'd earned that year combined. He mentioned that contract approvals went through a committee he sat on. He mentioned that he hoped my practice was going well, and that Copperveil was a good place to build a long career. He didn't say anything explicit. He didn't have to. I canceled my appointment with the county office. I told myself I would find another way, that I would wait for a safer moment, that the right opportunity would come. It never did, and eventually I left Copperveil rather than continue working in a county where I'd made myself complicit in something I was ashamed of. I am sending this to you because I heard through people who knew your daughter what happened to her at the commission meeting and in the months afterward. I heard what Holloway said about her publicly, the way he framed her as a disruptive presence, an unreliable voice, a woman with a grudge rather than a legitimate grievance. I heard that her cooperative lost its funding as a result of the failed proposal, and that several of its members quietly distanced themselves from her afterward to protect their own standing. She was right about everything. The proposal was sound. The vote was manipulated. And the man who manipulated it did so to protect money he was never supposed to have in the first place. I'm sorry I didn't say this sooner, when it would have changed something. I'm sending it now because silence has its own weight, and I've been carrying this one long enough. Peregrine Moss. Isolde read the letter twice. Then she sat down on the stone floor of her mother's greenhouse, with her back against the workbench and her knees drawn up and both letters in her lap, and she stayed there for a long time without moving. Outside, the wind had picked up along the ridge. She could hear it working through the fir canopy with that sound like distant water she'd noticed on the way in, steady and indifferent, the sound of a world that continued its business regardless. 41 years. The cooperative had dissolved 8 months after the failed vote. 12 small growers, people who trusted her to shepherd their proposal through the commission, had lost the agricultural protection status they'd been working toward for 3 years. Several had sold their land within the decade, unable to hold on against the development pressure that the failed rezoning had left them exposed to. 2 families she'd known well had left Copperveil entirely. And Crispin Holloway had sold those adjacent parcels in 1991 for 4 times what he'd paid for them, once the development he'd quietly enabled had run its course. She'd never known about the land, never known there was money behind it. She'd spent 41 years believing he'd blocked her proposal out of personal spite, out of the particular hostility some men carried toward women who spoke clearly in public rooms. That had been bad enough. This was something else entirely. She reached for the notebook and opened it again. Waverly's handwriting picked up mid-thought, as though she'd written the notebook entries across many sittings and saw no reason to reset between them. I received Zenobia's letter in June of 1984. Peregrine's came in September. I sat on both of them for 3 weeks before I decided what to do, which I'm not proud of. But I want you to understand the position I was in, Izzy, because I don't want you to think I simply did nothing. Holloway was, at that point, in his second term as alderman and being discussed seriously as a future county commissioner. He had the kind of social weight in Copperveil that gets built over decades, carefully and deliberately, through church committees and charity dinners and the particular art of making powerful people feel seen. Everyone liked him. More than that, everyone felt they owed him something, a favor called in, a word put in somewhere, a small kindness extended at the right moment. He collected those debts the way other men collected property. I made an appointment with the County Oversight Office myself in August of 1984. I brought copies of both letters. I sat across from a man named Gerald Pitts, who listened to everything I said with the expression of someone waiting for me to finish so he could explain why nothing could be done. He told me that the letters, while troubling, were hearsay, that Zenobia had not filed an official complaint at the time of the incident, that Peregrine had canceled his own appointment, and thus there was no formal record of his findings, that without corroborating documentation from official sources, there was no basis for an investigation. I asked him what would constitute corroborating documentation. He gave me a list that would have taken a trained investigator 6 months and subpoena power to assemble. I went home. 2 weeks later, Holloway came to the greenhouse. Isolde stopped reading. She looked up at the pale light coming through the glass panels above her and sat with that sentence for a moment before she continued. He came on a Thursday afternoon, which I remember because I'd been transplanting seedlings and had soil on my hands when I heard the door. I didn't invite him in. We spoke through the doorway. He was pleasant, the way Peregrine described him being pleasant in that office, which is to say his pleasantness was a vehicle for something else entirely. He said he'd heard I'd been making inquiries on Isolde's behalf. He said he understood a mother's instinct to protect her children, but that in this case, I was operating on incomplete information and risking real harm to my daughter's remaining reputation by continuing to stir a settled matter. He said Isolde had made enemies on the commission through her own conduct long before the March vote, and that pursuing this would only remind people of conflicts they'd mostly forgotten. Then he looked past me into the greenhouse and said he'd always admired what I'd built here. Said it was a remarkable piece of work for someone without formal construction experience. Said he hoped nothing would happen to compromise the property, given that the land use designation for this area of Caldwell Road was currently under review. He smiled when he said it. Then he left. I stood in the doorway of this greenhouse for a long time after his car disappeared down the track. I knew exactly what he'd meant. This property, my property, the only thing I'd built entirely by myself in my entire life, was sitting in a county where Crispin Holloway had influence over land use decisions. He hadn't threatened me directly. He was too careful for that. But the meaning was clear enough. I made a choice then that I have questioned every day since. I chose to protect the greenhouse instead of fighting him. I told myself I was protecting you too, Izzy, that without this land you'd have nowhere to come back to, that preserving it was a form of love even if it looked like cowardice from the outside. Maybe that was true. Maybe I was just afraid. Probably both. What I did instead was this. I gathered everything. Both letters, my own written account of the meeting with Gerald Pitts and the visit from Holloway. A copy of the land records Peregrine had reference that I tracked down myself through 2 weeks of careful work at the county records office, and a silk scarf you left here the night of the March meeting, which I found on the bench where you'd been sitting when you came here afterward. That comfort is built on what he did to you. It has always been built on that. She sat on the floor of the greenhouse with the oilcloth open across her lap, the 2 letters and the land records and her mother's notebook arranged around her, and the amber silk scarf folded across her knees in a color she hadn't seen in 41 years. Outside, the light had shifted. The afternoon was moving toward evening, the pale gray brightening slightly the way Oregon winter light sometimes did in the hour before it failed completely. Through the intact glass panels the sky was the color of old pewter, and somewhere in the firs above the property a bird was making a sound like a question asked repeatedly without expectation of an answer. Isolde pressed her hand flat against the silk scarf and felt the old familiar weight of everything she'd been carrying settle around her differently now. Still heavy, but with a shape she could finally work with. She had documents. She had witnesses, written testimony from 2 people who had seen the truth and recorded it even when they lacked the courage to speak it aloud. She had her mother's account of Holloway's threat, written clearly in a hand she could identify in any courtroom. She had land records showing financial corruption behind a public vote. And she had 41 years of being dismissed and whispered about and treated as a woman with a grudge rather than a woman with a legitimate grievance. Tomorrow was Thursday. The Copperveil Civic Luncheon met at the Grange on the 2nd Thursday of every month. She knew because she'd attended it herself for years before Holloway had made that particular room too hostile to enter. She had one night to prepare. She picked up the silk scarf, shook it gently, and draped it around her shoulders. Then she began to plan. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Isolde did not sleep that night. She didn't try particularly hard. She'd brought a wool blanket in her bag, along with the practical items she'd managed to pack before Thaddeus had started hovering near the door, and she wrapped it around herself on the long wooden bench nearest the back wall. With a residual warmth from the earth beneath the stone floor was just enough to make the cold manageable. She lay there listening to the wind working through the firs above the property and watching the darkness through the glass panels shift incrementally from black to deep gray as the hours moved. Her mind was not racing. That surprised her. She'd expected the kind of sleeplessness that came with anxiety, thoughts spinning without traction, the same fears cycling through repeatedly without resolution. Instead, her mind was doing something more deliberate, more like the focused stillness she got when she was working on a particularly difficult alteration, when the problem required sustained attention, rather than speed. She needed to be heard. That was the central problem, and everything else had to be arranged around it. She understood something about Copperveil that her children, who had grown up inside it without ever really examining it, had never fully grasped. This town ran on witness, not on official records or institutional process, but on who had seen what, in front of whom, and whether the people present were the kind of people whose account of events would be believed and repeated. Holloway had understood this better than anyone. His entire career had been built on managing witness, on being seen in the right rooms, doing the right things by the right people, and on ensuring that any unflattering account of his behavior reached the public through voices that could be easily discredited. She could not go to the county oversight office. She'd watched her mother try that and come home empty. She could not file a formal complaint through channels that Holloway, even at 82 and technically retired from public office, still had connections inside. She needed a room full of people who knew him, who had trusted him, who had spent decades defending him or simply assuming the best about him, and she needed to stand in that room and let the documents speak before anyone had time to manage the situation. The civic luncheon was the right room. It met at noon, which gave her the morning. She had one practical problem, which was that she had nothing to wear that would serve her. The clothes in her bag were what she'd grabbed in the 20 minutes Thaddeus had allowed her, functional and warm, but not the kind of thing you wore when you intended to be taken seriously in a public room. A gray cardigan, dark trousers that had seen better years, a coat that was warm enough but carried the look of something purchased from a clearance rack, which it had been. She needed to look like someone worth listening to. She knew from 41 years of being dismissed in this town exactly how much that mattered, how quickly a room full of people could decide not to hear you based purely on whether you looked like someone whose words carried weight. She sat up on the bench and turned her flashlight on and looked around the greenhouse properly for the first time with this problem in mind. Waverly's storage cupboard was still in the back left corner, a deep oak cabinet with 2 doors that Isolde remembered her mother keeping spare tools and seed stock in. She crossed the greenhouse and opened it. Tools mostly as expected. Old pruning shears, coils of garden wire, a stack of clay labels. But on the upper shelf, folded in a canvas bag, she found what she recognized immediately as her mother's good blouse. Navy silk, slightly faded but structurally perfect, the kind of quality that didn't deteriorate the way cheaper fabric did. Waverly had kept it here for reasons Isolde didn't know and didn't need to know. It was here, and it was the right size because Waverly and Isolde had always shared the same slight frame. Isolde took it down and laid it on the workbench. She spent the next 2 hours doing what she'd done her entire working life, assessing fabric, working with what was available, making something presentable from materials that weren't meant for the purpose. She modified the blouse's collar using a strip of fabric from the lining of her own coat, creating a cleaner, more structured neckline. She pressed the worst of the creases out using the flat side of a smooth stone she'd heated carefully over the small camp lighter she kept in her bag for emergencies. She did her hair in the dark by feel, pinning it the way she'd worn it to important occasions for 30 years, a low, neat arrangement that she could execute without a mirror, because her hands remembered the shape of it. By the time gray light began showing through the glass panels, she was ready. She looked down at herself in the small, compact mirror she'd packed. Navy silk, the amber scarf draped over her shoulders. White hair pinned cleanly. The documents from the metal box folded carefully in the canvas bag her mother had stored the blouse in. She looked like a woman who had something to say. She left the greenhouse at 8 in the morning, walked back down the Caldwell Road track through the firs, and turned toward town in the direction of the Copperveil Grange, where at noon the people who had known Crispin Holloway longest would be sitting down to lunch together. She had 4 hours. She would be precise. She would be calm. She would let Zenobia's letter and Peregrine's letter and the land records and her mother's notebook speak in sequence, and she would stand there in navy silk and an amber scarf and let the weight of documented truth do what her own voice alone had never been enough to do. The Grange came into view at 11:45. Cars already in the lot. Through the long windows, she could see people moving inside, the particular comfortable milling of a regular gathering, people who knew each other while settling into familiar rhythms. She pushed open the door and walked in. The room took a moment to notice her. That was how these things always worked in Copperveil. A ripple of recognition moving outward from whoever saw her first. A whisper passed sideways, a hand touched to a neighbor's arm. By the time Isolde had walked 12 feet into the Grange Hall, the nearest conversations had gone quiet, and the quiet was spreading. Crispin Holloway was seated at the far end of the central table, exactly where she'd expected him. He was 82 years old, white-haired and slightly diminished by age in the physical sense. Smaller than she remembered, the particular shrinking that happened to men who'd carried themselves large for decades. But he still held the room the way he always had, turned slightly outward in his chair, one arm resting on the table, positioned to receive rather than participate, the posture of a man accustomed to being the gravitational center of any gathering he entered. He saw her when she was halfway across the room. She watched his face go through three things in rapid succession: recognition, calculation, and beneath both of those, something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to its border that she could see it from where she stood. She stopped 6 feet from his end of the table. The room was fully quiet now. "Crispin," she said. "Not Alderman, not Mr. Holloway." 41 years had burned away whatever courtesy title she might once have extended him. Just his name, spoken clearly into a room that was holding its breath. Isolde. His voice was steady. She'd expected that. He'd had decades of practice keeping his voice steady. "This is unexpected." "I imagine it is," she said. She reached into the canvas bag and drew out the documents, holding them at her side rather than brandishing them. She wasn't performing. She was stating facts. In March of 1983, you blocked a rezoning proposal submitted by the Copperveil Small Growers Cooperative by pressuring 2 commission members to reverse their votes during a recess. The proposal had majority support before that recess. You knew it did. A murmur moved through the room. She continued before it could build into something she'd have to talk over. You blocked it because you privately owned land adjacent to the Fenwick Road corridor through a series of holding companies. Land whose development value depended on that rezoning failing. You were protecting a financial interest while sitting in a position of public trust. That is what happened. I have documentation. She placed Peregrine's letter on the table in front of him. Then Zenobia's. Then the land records her mother had spent 2 weeks at the county office compiling, each page copied carefully by hand in Waverly Thistlewood's forward-leaning script. Your planning commission clerk witnessed you telling me afterward that if I appealed the decision, you would damage my reputation publicly. She documented it the same night and sent a written account to my mother. Isolde's voice did not waver. You then came to my mother's property and implied that her land use designation was at risk if she pursued the matter. She was an elderly woman on her own, and you threatened her greenhouse. Holloway's hand on the table had gone still. These documents have been in my mother's greenhouse for 40 years, Isolde said, addressing the room now rather than just him. She preserved them because she couldn't use them safely while he had influence over her land. She hid them under the floor and left me instructions to find them when I had nothing left to lose. She paused for one breath. My children evicted me from my home 2 days ago. I went to that greenhouse with a single bag and nowhere else to go. So here I am. Someone at the back of the room said something she didn't catch. A woman near the window was crying quietly. She turned back to Holloway. Tell them the truth, she said. You've been comfortable in this town for 41 years on the back of what you did. Tell them. The silence stretched. Holloway looked at the documents spread in front of him, looked at the room full of people he'd cultivated for decades, looked at Isolde standing in her mother's navy blouse with the amber scarf at her shoulders, and something in the architecture of his composure gave way. The vote, he started, then stopped. Started again. The proposal should have passed. I had interests I didn't disclose. I used my position to protect those interests, and I used what influence I had to make sure no one could effectively challenge the outcome afterward. His voice had dropped to something that was barely carrying across the table. What I said to Isolde after the meeting was intended to discourage her from pursuing an appeal. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. The room erupted. Isolde stood still in the center of it. She didn't feel triumphant, exactly. Vindication, after 41 years, didn't feel the way she'd imagined in the occasional moments she'd allowed herself to imagine it. It felt quieter, more like a long-held breath finally released than anything explosive or dramatic. By Friday morning, a regional news outlet had picked up the story. By Saturday, it had traveled further, carried on the particular current of stories that touch something people recognize: an elderly woman, a decades-old wrong, documents hidden under a greenhouse floor by a mother who loved her daughter enough to preserve the truth even when she couldn't speak it. Thessaly Odia, a civil attorney based in Eugene who had seen the coverage, called Isolde on Sunday afternoon offering to take her case without charge. The civil complaint was filed within 3 weeks. Holloway's legal team did not contest it with any vigor. The settlement came through in 8 weeks, enough for Isolde to purchase a small house on the eastern edge of Copperveil with a south-facing yard she immediately began planning as a garden. Her children came to her on a Wednesday, all 3 of them, standing on the doorstep of the house she was renting while the purchase went through, looking like people who had rehearsed what they intended to say and found all of it inadequate on arrival. Thaddeus spoke first. "We didn't know," he said, "about any of it, about what he did or what you'd been carrying." "You didn't ask," Isolde said. "For 41 years, not one of you asked me directly whether I was telling the truth. You grew up with my version of events and his reputation, and you chose his reputation because it was easier and more comfortable. That's what I need you to understand." Karina was crying. Oswin was looking at the ground. She let them in, not because their remorse erased anything, but because Waverly had preserved truth across 4 decades out of love rather than vengeance. And Isolde understood now that love and vengeance couldn't occupy the same hand simultaneously. You had to choose which one you were going to work with. She chose what her mother had modeled. The greenhouse on the Caldwell Road property she restored herself over the following spring, working slowly and carefully, replacing the cracked panels, clearing the dead growth from the benches, replanting the south-facing wall with the same variety of orchid her mother had always kept there. She found a supplier in Portland and ordered 12 plants, hanging them in terracotta pots along the glass in colors that seemed almost aggressive against the gray Oregon sky. On the workbench nearest the back wall, in a place where the morning light came through cleanest, she placed her mother's notebook, open to the last page, and beside it the amber silk scarf, pressed and folded, and the small orchid that had survived everything, still pushing its thin green stem upward through cracked soil, still insisting on continuing regardless. She visited every Thursday morning. She always brought tea. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.